Hi, I'm Mark Lutter. I'm the founder and executive director of the Charter Cities Institute. Thank you all for coming. I think there's pretty stiff competition at this conference, so it's good to see everyone here. So, just the theme of this talk is it's happening. And unfortunately, I could not find a higher resolution GIF than this. And this GIF, also GIF, whatever we want to call it, might date me a little bit, right? This was cool 10 years ago. But what I think we've seen over the last year or two is a lot of projects start. And when I started the Charter Cities Institute about 8 years ago, and the first 5 years, 6 years were kind of selling the idea, building out the intellectual framework, which was definitely fun and exciting on some margins, but also quite frustrating because, like, what we set for ourselves as the metric of success is like things actually happening on the ground, right? Are you getting laws passed? Are you moving dirt? Are people living there and are their lives improving? And it feels like we have started that little kind of early stage of that S curve. And these are very long term projects, like multi decade projects. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of execution. There's a little bit of luck and elbow grease involved. But it really feels like we've kind of turned the corner there. And so this talk, I hope to communicate that. What are some of the projects on the ground? What's going on? And how do we look at things moving forward? So first, just to start with kind of a little bit of history, right? Why charter cities? So Shenzhen, except for the railway, post, telecommunications, banking, civil aviation, national defense, all other management authority was delegated to the provincial government. This was in 1980. Deng Xiaoping had just taken power. People call Shenzhen a special economic zone, which it was, but it was also basically a charter city, right? The entire area was 320 square kilometers, and they basically delegated a huge amount of authority. They didn't just cut taxes, right? They delegated a huge amount of authority to the provincial government, or the provincial government. Within 4 years, Shenzhen had the tallest building in all of China. Uh, Shenzhen pioneered labor markets, they pioneered land markets, they pioneered financial markets in China, all of these things that were really critical to Chinese economic development. A fun story, how they kind of pioneered labor markets is they got investors from Hong Kong to build a hotel, and they got Chinese women to staff the hotel. And the investors were like, "Guys, you need to change the sheets every day, and you should wear makeup." And the women working there were like, "You are capitalist pigs. We're not going to do that." And the investors were like, "Okay, we will give you money in exchange for your services." And then they were like, "Okay, we can make this work." Right. And that was like literally one of the first kind of labor markets in modern China. A little bit of a goofy story, but kind of shows how this spreads. Right, China is the most successful economic development story since World War II, arguably like ever, if you sort of exclude the Industrial Revolution. It was largely driven by a combination of urbanization and special economic zones. Right after Shenzhen was started, along with three other special economic zones in 1984, they passed, implemented a lot more in '88, even more. Right, so this strategy of economic reform at a local level, targeting rapidly urbanizing areas, was extremely successful in economically liberalizing China. And I think that's important. And it is also important to note that China had several constraints that were substantially different from the rest of the world. So we're not likely to see similar success to Chinese urbanization and economic growth. Mao forcibly prevented urbanization because he was afraid of getting nuked by the Soviets. So there's pent up demand for urbanization. China has a multi-thousand-year state history. They successfully built a atomic bomb in like 67, right? So they had a pretty sophisticated bureaucracy and were able to handle some of these kind of complex issues much more effectively than other countries. But I think the general framework is good. And this general framework is delegated authority allows for iterated improvement. Many special economic zones don't really delegate authority. They will cut laws around the edges. So they'll say there are lower taxes or there's a slightly different labor law, but they don't allow for a new kind of local authority to figure out what works best. Right. And you need that because if you don't get it perfectly right the first time, if you have to go back to the government every time to make a change, that's a really long cycle. Two is scale matters. Right. Why cities are the smallest unit that can have sustained economic growth. If you reform a block in New York, right, change tax code, change labor law, that block might become very successful, but it's not going to change the underlying growth rate of New York. Right. If you substantially change the laws in New York, that might change the underlying growth rate of New York. And three, you have to match the problem with the zone, right? Different areas have different levels of governance, different levels of economic activity, different levels of talent. So it's not this one size fits all. We're going to create the perfect governing system forever. It's let's figure out what governing constraints are preventing more economic activity, more economic growth in this country, in this area, in this region, and how do we reform those in a kind of politically compatible way to make things work? So there are two types of charter cities. Some of you might recognize these photos. One is pushing the frontier, that is Duna Tower in Prospera in Honduras. The other is catch-up growth. This is Ciudad Morazan, also in Honduras. Prospera is targeting biotech companies, digital nomads, high income people from around the world, some Hondurans, but mostly kind of a little bit more externally focused. Ciudad Morazan is targeting Hondurans. Honduras is a very violent country. If you're upper income, you will move to a gated community. If you are lower income, you don't leave the house after 7 p.m. because you might get mugged. Ciudad Morazan basically says, okay, let's figure out how to provide housing at a price point with security for people in lower middle income for Hondurans. And so it's a gated community, but the units cost, I think, $120 a month. They might have raised the price $150 a month. And it's safe. Kids play outside in a way that they wouldn't in the surrounding kind of neighborhood or city. And many of the people living there don't even realize it's a charter city or a zeta, right? They're unaware. There's the woman who's the mayor, her mom like hates zetas. And so it's kind of funny watching her interact with the developer. And the developer is let's call him a brash Italian man that likes to argue, and watching them kind of go back and forth was fun. So world is urbanizing very rapidly, and like it's much easier to make reforms both with governance as well as with infrastructure when people don't live in an area. So Paris, when they built modern Paris, they had to have a dictator, and they like bulldozed half of Paris to build boulevards that were large enough to march armies down so they wouldn't have another revolution. But it's much easier to do that and without a dictator if you do it before people move to an area. And that's two things. It's one, making sure you clearly define like what public spaces are, what private spaces are, where the roads are going to be, where the parks are going to be, right? What are the lot sizes? And two, it also includes governance, right? If a lot of people live in an area, there will be special interests, many of which will be heavily invested in the status quo. And if you can make reforms in places where you can predict people are going to live, then that allows for hopefully getting it right or getting it closer to right on the first try, which is just much easier than trying to reform something after it already exists, after people already live there. So that's mostly in the developing world, right? That urbanization is all happening in Africa and Asia. The US, Europe, we're all highly urbanized. Why are charter cities important in the US, in the developed world? Because I'm sure many of you are familiar with all of these examples, or at least some of them, right? Maui still hasn't built housing. The fire was there 2 or 3 years ago. I don't think really any housing has been built in Palisades in California. This was a New York Times earlier this year. There was a fish that prevented a dam being built. And once they did genetic sequencing on the fish, they discovered it was not a separate species. It was basically a similar species to one in, I don't know, 5 ponds over. And they like prevented this very large power generating project. Right. And so the value of charter cities in kind of high income countries is, how do you remove some of these barriers to large scale infrastructure projects, investment growth, things like that? So I haven't really defined charter cities, but let's do that. Charter cities are new cities with better laws is kind of a shorthand way to think about it. More deeply, it's a public policy tool to improve governance. I think a lot of people want charter cities to be this like some utopian experiment, but it's not. Right? It's just, here's a public policy tool that can improve governance, and it's not going to lead to everyone holding hands and singing kumbaya, but hopefully it can lead to changes in rules that lead to sustained economic growth in a place that otherwise would not have had it. So here, I've talked about this a little bit, but just to go in more detail, many of you are probably familiar with this picture, North Korea and South Korea. Context matters. You're not going to build Hong Kong in a island that's in the middle of the Pacific, right? You can have the best rules in the world. If people don't otherwise want to live there, if there's no economic activity there, people aren't going to live there, right? So you have to think about like what are existing patterns of economic development, of trade, of population, of talent, et cetera, and then match the solution to the problem, right? Many parts of the world, basically all the world, right? You could have more economic activity, you could have more investment if the rules are a little bit better, but like San Francisco, for example, is the capital of AI, and it has bad governance on many margins, right? The city government is hostile to tech, or at least was until relatively recently. There's been a lot of kind of public order challenges that the city has faced. They don't want to build any new housing, and it's still the center of tech because network effects are really strong. So I think we have to take all these things into consideration when thinking about charter cities. It's like, what margin can we actually execute on? So the theory of change is basically, I think this is another very important part about charter cities. I guess, cut my teeth, right? Did my PhD at George Mason University, worked with a lot of libertarian groups in Washington, D.C. Some people are here at this conference, if not in this room. And I got a little bit skeptical about a lot of the work they were doing. It felt like a lot of it was writing white papers that few people would read that wouldn't really move the needle. Everyone would say, oh, we're changing the Overton window. But it didn't feel like there was like tangible steps towards like traction and scale. Part of the challenge is, right, economic liberalization faces the collective action problem. In the U.S., the classic example with this is sugar farmers. The U.S. has very high tariffs on sugar because there are a few farmers in Florida that produce sugar, and they're not competitive globally, but those tariffs make them competitive in the U.S. So everybody pays slightly higher prices for sugar in exchange for basically benefiting the small group of farmers. But charter cities reverse this logic of collective action, right? If you have a developer that benefits from economic liberalization with that increase in land price, there's a strong financial interest to replicate that in other places. And I think that is important because if you get charter cities right, there's a cascading effect. We saw this with China. We also saw this with the Middle East, where after the Dubai International Financial Center was created, now you've got Qatar, what is it, Abu Dhabi Global Market, Qatar Financial Center, Astana Financial Center, right? There's a bunch of these that basically replicated that form of institutional change. So it's time to build. Right. So here's just an overview of projects. We're involved in all of these, I think, except for this one. So Honduras, just because everyone it's probably the most prominent charter cities project that people are aware of. There's an election coming up in a little over a month. The government currently has declared there was a constitutional ruling saying that the law that allowed charter cities is unconstitutional. And the Prospera is suing the government for $11 billion. So if the opposition wins, I think the opposition is likely to win. However, it's Honduras, so it is possible something else happens. Then it is likely that these projects will see a lot more success. Prospera, as most of you know, is focused on biotech digital nomads. Ciudad Morazan is focused on manufacturing and working class. Ciudad Morazan was cash flow positive prior to the last election when the leftist party got in power. And that's when their industrial tenants left. And now they're operating basically at a loss because the entrepreneur, Massimo, is very passionate about this project and also quite successful. So he can underwrite the residential component. This project is one that I'm perhaps most excited about, could be the most impactful. I was there about a week ago, met with government officials. They're willing to cut a deal, it sounds like. So it's basically a unsuccessful charter city. In 1955, the government of the Bahamas was working with basically a American and said, if you build a deep water port, we will create a municipal government that you control and give you a bunch of land. And he did, and they did. In the 60s, it was kind of an East Coast Vegas. They had a casino before there was one in every corner. They had famous musical acts coming. They had the mob laundering money, right? The whole shebang. In the 70s, the Bahamas became independent and were like, why is our second most populous island being dominated by Americans? And started squeezing. So on paper, this municipal government has the right to issue work permits and basically control almost all commercial activity in the zone. In practice, this has not been enforced in 50 years. It's a very delicate situation. The government has taken the two families that own the asset to arbitration, but there's an election upcoming in May, and it seems like the pressure of the election and the current tension might make it possible to kind of cut a deal. What's exciting about this is it's tremendous scale. A lot of these projects you can't build a city on because you need a lot of land to build a city. Here, there's enough land to build a city. And two, the location makes it really easy to activate. Many of these projects are a little bit removed, a little bit in the middle of nowhere, so it might be a multi-year process to activate them, to get the first buildings built, the infrastructure scaled up. Here, there's an airport. The existing infrastructure can hold 250,000 people, even though only 50,000 live on the island, right? If you cut a deal with government and you have a rebranding and you simplify the investment process, it can accelerate immediately. And so it'll be a delicate dance until May, but we will see what happens. We hosted the New City Summit, and this is our second annual New City Summit. We hosted in Kenya. We had 400 plus delegates. We brought together projects, funders, government officials, service providers. We had an accelerator to help early projects kind of think through their strategy and fundraise. So it feels like there is momentum, right? We're starting to get more interest, build out that brand, see things start to happen. This is another very exciting project. They signed an agreement with the government of Sierra Leone about 3 months ago. It creates a public private authority with full fiscal regulatory authority on Shorbro Island. Shorbro Island is a 600 square kilometer island off the coast of Sierra Leone. It's led by Idris Elba, the actor, and Siaka Stevens. Siaka Stevens is the grandson of one of the founding fathers of Sierra Leone. Idris Elba, I always forget, his mom or his dad is from Sierra Leone. So they've been working on this almost a decade. Siaka spoke at our summit. They signed this agreement 3 months ago. Their strategy is to start with basically tourism, high-end residential. There's boutique hotels, charge $1,000, $2,000 a night. You do some residential, target kind of African Americans and African diaspora who really like that part of the story. As you scale up, then you can attract like investment bankers, lawyers, accountants living in West Africa. Eventually, you hit the price point where you can do manufacturing, do processing of goods. Lots of goods are extracted in Africa or produced in Africa, but the processing is often done in other countries. And so with good governance, this could be kind of a center of a kind of manufacturing industry in Africa, right? The 50-year vision is basically Hong Kong of West Africa. They have the charter, which is very important. The cold start problem will be very challenging, right? The island is relatively remote, but it could have a very large impact. So India, we are working with a local group called the Foundation for Economic Development. They've gotten special economic zone legislation passed in Uttar Pradesh. It creates a 30,000-acre special economic zone focused on electronics manufacturing and exports. India, for its current level of development, has a very strong service sector, a relatively weak manufacturing sector. So we think this can be a really important project to help create a solid foundation in India, at least Uttar Pradesh. And Uttar Pradesh is like 200 some million people. So right, like that can hopefully be quite impactful. And what we're doing now is we're planning a conference in India to basically bring together government, other stakeholders, because they passed the legislation, but the implementation has been pretty slow. So a lot of this is just like figuring out how to do the right dance with the right stakeholders so they kind of push a little bit harder than they otherwise might. So Zanzalu, some of you might have heard of Zuzalu. Zuzalu was a pop-up city in Montenegro organized by Vitalik Buterin about 2 years ago. So we hosted a spinoff 2 years in a row. Next year will be our third year. We haven't finalized the dates, but it's in June. So if any of you want an excuse to visit Zanzibar or Africa, Zanzibar is a pretty good place. It's a semi-autonomous island off the coast of East Africa. It's part of Tanzania, but like Hong Kong was, it's kind of like one country, two systems because it was independent before. Fumba Town is a town that's in a special economic zone about 20, 30 minutes south of the capital as well as the airport. Here our goal is bring together people working on tech, especially tech that is relevant for Africa, as well as people working out on charter cities and other kind of more boring infrastructure development things, and have an environment, right? Our big summit is pretty buttoned up, right? Real estate developers are not good at letting loose. They like to wear suits. This event is perhaps a little bit more chill, like it's 2 weeks, so hopefully allows for a little bit better flow of conversation, building longer term relationships, to help kind of, change the narrative and hopefully get people a little bit more excited about some of these things. So we have the Urban Expansion Company. One way to think about it is building suburbs, but targeting people, the median income African who might be making $2,000 a year. So Africa is adding 25 million new urban residents annually. Many of these new urban residents end up living in informal settlements or slums. So we're working with Patrick Lampson Hall, who has done urban expansion with municipalities. But the question is, how do you do this in a kind of profit-driven way that can provide these services, but perhaps scale a little bit more aggressively than African governments otherwise might be able to? And we're also working with an executive who used to do large-scale urban development in Africa, except he was doing it at a much higher price point. So we hopefully close the seed round in the next month and have negotiated a potential first project in Mozambique. The general kind of, rule of thumb is, right, we're targeting 1,000-hectare plots, so it'll be 2,500 acre outside of existing urban centers, targeting more secondary cities and primary cities because we believe it'll be a little bit easier to get planning permission in secondary cities than primary cities. And doing infrastructure build out, then selling, leasing plots. We need to cut deals with governments to allow small plot sizes and to allow kind of a phased infrastructure build out, because that might be not be legal under their current zoning law. So we'll have to kind of cut a developers agreement with the government. So this one, I think we're quite excited about the ability to impact and scale. And hopefully when I see all of you next year, right, we'll have the first, I don't know, 2 projects lined up and be even moving dirt in one. This one can move pretty quickly once we get it rolling. We have the African Urban Lab. We partnered with the African School of Economics, which is a university in economics founded by Leonard Wanchikon, who's a professor of economics at Princeton. Our African Urban Lab is based in Zanzibar. It's teaching the next generation of African urban leaders. Their next cohort starts in a few weeks. Last year, they had 38 people. This year, I think they are accepting about 70. And there, it's basically, I think, 2 weeks in the fall, 2 weeks in the spring, intensive course, plus a kind of capstone project to understand urban principles better and how they can apply them. I think last year they had one mayor who attended. So, right, training the next generation of Africans to tackle these kind of substantial challenges in the rapid urbanization that is currently occurring on the continent. Freedom cities. So Trump, about 2.5 years ago, gave a speech on freedom cities. It's a 4-minute speech you can find on YouTube pretty easily. The way we think about this is kind of special economic zones in the US. The US is already highly urbanized. Like, there's the possibility for some new city projects like California Forever. But I think the kind of higher leverage thing is figuring out how to simplify, expedite some regulatory procedures. So there is a working group. There's some administration interest in an executive order. An executive order doesn't do a lot; it does a little bit. Ideally, we want legislation, but with an executive order, we can at least introduce legislation and then map the kind of coalition. We see this as a long-term play. Like, yes, we would love to get it done this year, but we are kind of realistic in the challenge of some of these things. We're working with some groups that would benefit from becoming a freedom city. And what we're proposing is basically create like an office of freedom cities. We could call it like in, I don't know, OSTP or in OMB. And then projects could apply to that office for freedom city status. What that would entail is a combination of, they would say, look, we want regulatory exemption from XYZ. Here's why this is not going to lead to pollution or all these negative consequences. That office would consider it, say yes or no, and then maybe also include some tax concessions like opportunity zones. So we've spoken with several legislative offices, and we've got kind of a consortium. When the government shutdown ends, we will perhaps have a slightly better idea of how exactly to push this forward. The government shutdown has impacted our ability to work with government, so we're waiting for that to end before we kind of start the hard push. So with that, make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. We are trying to accomplish very big and long-term projects. When they started building this cathedral, they didn't know how to do the unsupported dome. They previously knew in Rome, the Parthenon is an unsupported dome, and they'd forgotten. And so they started without knowing how to do this. And then they ran a contest and figured out how to do this. So it's a nice story about, I don't know, doing big long-term projects that you don't know exactly how they'll end, but hopefully are worthwhile anyway. So with that, here's how you can contact me. Twitter, the Charter Cities Institute, my email. Feel free to reach out.